Welcome back to Whispers from the Walls, everyone. Today, we're diving into a topic that I think is incredibly important, often overlooked, and honestly, a bit uncomfortable for many people to confront. We tend to believe, don't we, that a person's story, especially when it comes to mental health struggles, begins the moment they enter an institution, like an asylum. It's almost like a clean slate or a clear starting point for their troubles.
Yeah, I think that's a really common misconception, Jane. It's almost easier for us, as a society, to point to a specific moment or a specific place, like an asylum, and say, that's where the issue began. It externalizes it, makes it a contained problem, rather than looking deeper into the roots, which can be much messier.
Exactly. And that's precisely what the Quieting trilogy challenges, especially with Lillian's story. Her journey, her struggles, they don't start with the gates of Greer Asylum closing behind her, not even close. Her story, her wounds, actually begin long before that. They start within the walls of the Davenport home, the very place that was supposed to be her sanctuary, her safe space.
The house that raised her, right? It's such a powerful concept. We think of homes as places of comfort, warmth, security. But what if the house itself, or rather, the environment within it, is the very thing that molds you in ways that are deeply damaging? A house can wound without ever laying a hand on you, and that's the chilling truth the books really explore.
It's a really stark image, isn't it? Wounds without ever laying a hand. You know, when we talk about trauma, people often jump to physical abuse or very overt forms of neglect. But the kind of wounds that Lillian experiences, and what many children experience, can be much more subtle, insidious even. A cold room, not in temperature, but in emotional resonance. A distant mother. A father who measures worth by silence and obedience. Those aren't dramatic, headline-grabbing acts, but their cumulative effect can be devastating.
That's where the real damage lies, I think. It's the consistent emotional landscape. Imagine growing up in an environment where your emotional needs are just consistently unmet, where affection is conditional or completely absent, where your very presence feels like an intrusion. A child in a home like that learns to shrink themselves, right? They learn to make themselves small, to quiet their needs, to become invisible just to keep the peace. It's a survival mechanism.
And it's heartbreaking because those survival mechanisms, while essential in that moment, become incredibly maladaptive later in life. What starts as a way to cope with a dysfunctional home environment morphs into deep-seated patterns of behavior, of self-worth, of relating to the world. Lillian's journey into the asylum isn't an isolated event. It's the culmination of years, decades even, of these subtle wounds festering.
And then, when these individuals finally reach a breaking point, when they're labeled troubled or mentally ill, no one really bothers to ask what shaped them. They just see the outward manifestation of the trauma, the symptoms, and try to treat those. But if you don't address the foundational cracks, the structural damage within the house that raised them, how can you ever truly heal the person?
It's like trying to fix a leaky roof without ever looking at the foundation. You know, I think about that phrase, a distant mother. It's not necessarily a mother who isn't physically present, but one who is emotionally unavailable, always preoccupied, always stressed, never truly connecting. And for a child, that emotional void can feel just as devastating as outright abandonment.
Or the father who values silence and obedience above all else. That's a common one, isn't it? Children should be seen and not heard. While it might sound like an old adage, in practice, it stifles a child's voice, their individuality, their ability to express their own emotions and thoughts. You learn to suppress yourself to gain approval, and that approval becomes your entire world.
And the problem is, these kinds of homes, the Davenport home being a prime example in the trilogy, often look perfectly respectable from the outside. They might be affluent, well-maintained, outwardly successful families. No one would ever suspect the emotional wasteland within those four walls. That's what makes the Quieting trilogy so impactful. It strips away that veneer of respectability and shows the raw, brutal truth of what happens behind closed doors.
It really highlights that trauma isn't always loud or obvious. It's layered. It's inherited. It's often passed down through generations, not through malice, but through unaddressed wounds, through learned behaviors. A distant parent might have had distant parents themselves, perpetuating a cycle without even realizing the harm they're doing.
That's a terrifying thought, that these wounds can be inherited, not genetically, of course, but through the emotional blueprint of a family. The Quieting Trilogy doesn't treat the asylum as the root of everything, which is so refreshing. Instead, it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the deepest wounds often begin in the very rooms people think look respectable, in the quiet corners of what's perceived as a normal, functioning home.
It really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? Instead of asking, what's wrong with this person, it prompts us to ask, what happened to this person? What environment shaped them into who they are today? It's a much more empathetic and ultimately a more accurate way of understanding mental suffering.
And for Lillian, that's crucial. We see her navigate the complexities of her past, the subtle manipulations, the emotional starvation she endured. Her coping mechanisms, which might seem erratic or troubled to an outsider, make perfect sense when viewed through the lens of her upbringing. She developed strategies to survive, and those strategies became ingrained.
It speaks to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, even when it's pushed to its absolute limits, but also the profound cost of that resilience. These children, they don't just get over it. They carry those houses with them, metaphorically speaking, into every relationship, every challenge, every new environment they encounter.
So, when Lillian eventually finds herself within the asylum walls, it's not the beginning of her story, but perhaps a new chapter where these long-standing, unaddressed wounds are finally brought to the surface. And the trilogy really excels at illustrating that continuum, showing how the past doesn't just disappear, it informs the present in profound ways.
It also makes you think about how we define normal or healthy environments. If a home can be pristine on the outside, but emotionally desolate on the inside, how many people are living with these hidden scars, struggling in silence because their trauma isn't visible or easily categorized?
Countless, I'd imagine. And that's the power of literature like the Quieting Trilogy. It gives voice to those experiences, makes them tangible, and hopefully helps readers understand that what they see on the surface isn't always the full truth. It encourages a deeper, more compassionate inquiry into people's histories.
It's a call to look beyond the labels, really, to understand that someone isn't broken just because they're struggling. They might just be reacting to a lifetime of invisible injuries sustained in the most intimate of spaces, their own childhood home. And that understanding is the first step towards true empathy and, dare I say, healing.
Absolutely. It reminds us that every person carries a history, and that history, especially the one written within the walls of our first home, can be the most defining part of our journey. Thank you all for this incredibly insightful discussion.
You've been listening to Whispers from the Walls. To truly understand where Lillian's journey begins, delve into the quieting. The trilogy completes her story and illuminates the profound impact of the past.